get to talking about Nepal. I'm talking about my experience there. And my experience is in the past right now. I'm going to start from the beginning because I think the life of a missionary can start quite early, and that was the topic that was given to me. So I started as early as I could remember back. I grew up in a small EUB church with many special people who mentored me, but I'll lift up a few of them. There was Pearl's witness. She was a Sunday school teacher. She was also introduced me to missionary nurse, missionary women on paper, and I started getting a letter from a missionary nurse in Africa when I was quite young. In fact, the letter was kind of long for me to read, even at my age. As a young teacher, I was encouraged to become a Sunday school teacher for the kindergarten or the wee little kids. And then when I was 11, I had another mentor. It was a pastor's wife named Dorothy, and she taught catechism. That's in our church in Sedgwick, Kansas. We call that confirmation. I don't know whether that's a general Methodist term or just ours, but Dorothy led us through a lot of memorizing and searching our faith and things like that. And at the end, I asked for baptism in the spring. And during baptism, I had a real experience of the Holy Spirit blessing me. Then later, when I was in 8th grade, I needed to do a lot of tests and papers and things in order to transfer from my grade school to the high school in the county where we lived. And during that time, my teacher was also a mentor and helped me with a lot of information. And these other mentors from church also would help me find things that I could sift through and decide what I thought my plans would be, as one of my papers was on that, what I thought I would do in the future. It included going to college, and I found out I could go to either Kansas State or KU or other smaller colleges in Kansas. This process led to a lot of praying and really trying to decide what I would do. And I was only in the 8th grade at that time, so it was just the very beginning of my calling. I think I'll now jump on to 1969. In 1968, our little 3-year-old daughter and my husband and I traveled halfway around the world to Nepal. And we learned some of the language of the Nepali official government language, because that was the only one that was spoken throughout the whole country, even though it's as small as 2/3 the size of Arkansas. And all the other languages in Nepal were just spoken in one little pocket here or there. And because we'd be moving around, we needed to have a language that would go any place in the country that we might be speaking. We did language, and then in 1969, we moved to the village where we would be living for the next 5 years. And my husband was assigned to work at the boarding school, which is 20 minutes walk from the house where we lived. I was allowed to find my own work there. And before that, I had a major event happening, because in February, our older son, Brian, was born. And that was a fun thing for the villagers to find a white child living in their village. and growing up for 5 years there. From the very beginning, I had a Nepali helper who I employed to help with my housework, to keep the house while I was away doing other things, to keep my children while I was away doing other things. And that meant that my house was always open. Many times I would come home from whatever I had been doing, and there would be people waiting on the doorstep or in the living room because they needed medical help, or they had some other kind of problem that they figured I could help them to deal with. So I started early. It's kind of like a little mini health post, and I learned the medical care there. I learned that I could be more of a nurse practitioner than I thought, because I hadn't been trained to be a nurse practitioner. It just happened that that's what I needed to do. And it helped for all the future jobs that I did in Nepal too, to learn. And shortly, when I began being a school nurse, I really needed to learn a lot of more doctor type of stuff that nurses know about but don't usually do in the United States. And I was surprised to find out that there were no laws in Nepal that said that I shouldn't be doing these doctor type of things anyhow. So the mission that we went to was made up of a whole conglomerate of mission groups. There were United Methodists, there were Baptists, there were people from all different countries, from Scandinavia, from Australia, from UK, and of course from America. And we all worked together because the government wouldn't let us in the country if we came individually as one denomination. And so that helped to put the Nepali church on a good, solid foundation. It meant that all Nepalis can worship together. There isn't a little Baptist church over there and a little Methodist church over here. They're all worshiping together, and they're growing in their spiritual life together. When we first started, I wasn't there, but when they first started the mission to Nepal 65 years ago, there were no Christians in Nepal. A few of the people who came in as missionaries were actually of Nepali descent, but they had grown up outside of Nepal and came back to bring the gospel to their own native land. And just every 3 years or so, well, at first, of course, it was not doubling, but after the first few years, about every 3 years, we'd ask, how many Christians are there now? And it doubled every time. So there was 1 million at one time, and eventually, I don't know how many there are now. I don't know whether this paper has it that you have or not, but there are a lot of Christians there, but the population in Nepal has grown just as much as the people who become Christians, so the percentage of people in Nepal has not increased substantially through the years because the population grows so fast that it almost keeps ahead of you all. When I was first in Nepal and doing my doorstep doctoring, I found that I had a lot of freedom. Now, in Nepali culture, people can't touch lots of other people, such as men can't touch women. That's one reason why they needed women missionaries originally. Certain castes can't touch other castes. There were a lot of things that Hindus had to abide by, rules that I did not have to. I could touch anybody that, had a physical problem or something that was aching or something. And I could let them say all kinds of naughty things. I probably didn't understand it anyhow. If they had an anger problem or things like that, that was okay. I was looking at the person. Years later, when I would go back to some of those early places where I learned to do my doctoring jobs, people would say that they still remembered my cool hands. They loved to have me touch them. And they felt that that was a healing effect on their lives, because it was a way that they got to know that they were okay and that they were going to be okay. Now, in Nepal, it was illegal to preach, evangelize, to spread the gospel, because it was a Hindu country. And in fact, the Hindus had tried to get rid of the Buddhists too, but they could never, the Buddhists kind of just worked in with the Hindus, and so they couldn't really get rid of the Buddhists, but they tried to keep the Christians out. So how can you witness in a land where you can't talk about Christianity? And we could figure that out because we had friends. Sometimes they'd ask, and if they ask about Christianity, you'd be rude not to tell them. They also would notice that we went to meetings together. Now, at first, it was mostly just the Western people from, like all the countries I named before, who would get together and we'd speak English. But as soon as we had a Nepali staff person that was Nepali speaking, why we started having half of our meetings would be in Nepali language, and anybody in the village was welcome to come and watch if they'd like. If somebody asked, what do you do in your meetings? We'd say, well, come and see. We meet at such and such a place on such and such a time, and you're welcome to come and see what we do in our meetings. That wasn't telling them that they had to learn about Christianity, but it was an invitation. The first place that we had our meetings when we first went to the boarding school was at the carpenter shop. Now, the school had been started in just temporary kind of lean-to buildings because they wanted to get the school started and then they would build the building. So the first 10 years or so, they were building all the time that they were having school there. And the carpenter shop was just a roof with 4 posts to hold the roof up. And so we could easily go in and sit on the things that they used for tools all week. And on Saturday, which was the day off, why we could use it as our place of worship. Later, we moved to a place that was built on down the campus. And then 5 years later, when we moved from the village 20 minutes walk away to near the school, our living room became the new place to meet. The front 2 rooms upstairs, we had a wall taken out, so we had a nice long room. And although if you put chairs in, maybe you could get 30 people in, it'd be crowded. If you didn't put chairs in, you could get lots of people in. And so we had one sofa at the one end of the room, and the rest of the room didn't have furniture, except if we put up a playpen for, we had a second son by that time, and he lots of times would play in that playpen, and villagers would come in that far to our home and play with him through the playpen. But since it was upstairs, we didn't want him to be loose on the floor and get down where he could fall down the stairs. The church became, our living room became the church. And the students lived right across the road from us, and they would have their morning meal, and then they would come directly over and wait for church on Saturday morning. Well, the adults and all the people who were actually Christian didn't come till about an hour later. So during that time, we'd get out the songbooks, and we learned Nepali choruses and Nepali songs, and we really enjoyed the singing with them, and I think they did too. And I noticed as we moved around Nepal in the years after those first 9 years, that most all of the services in Nepal were very similar to that. They did praise and worship for about an hour first, and then they had the preaching and the whole service like we have here. That would always take an hour, sometimes an hour and a half even, that last part. But it was all one. Everybody came for the songs in those days. And we were very blessed to find that some of our students were becoming the pastors in some of these churches. And so as we moved around the country, it would be nice to be able to worship in a group where our former student was actually the leader of that church. I read somewhere recently, God sent people. He didn't send mass media. He didn't send pamphlets. Jesus lived among the people that he came to, and we lived among the people that we went to. My work was often living with my students, maybe an overnight in the village or maybe a month in the village with my students, or maybe just out in the morning where we all walked together for a few miles up the way and then walk back in the evening. But we did it, and I would sometimes think of, this is kind of like Jesus and his disciples, only my students were learning nursing and community nursing at that. But we were in a very similar situation of a walking society. One of the nice things about living there with my students was, especially after I got to having just girl students, it seemed like my time out in the village was usually over Christmas time. By that time, Christmas was a legal holiday for Christians. Since I was a Christian, I got that day off. Because my students were not Christian, they did not have the day off, so I'd have to leave them with assignments and things to do that day. And then I traveled back into the city where my husband lived, and we would go to the church to have Christmas with the church. And then in the evening I would come back, and the students would have planned with me what we could have for the meal and the evening meal, because they wanted to have Christmas in the evening after I'd come back from the Christian Christmas in the city. And then they would I usually made up just little gifts or things that they could enjoy, so that they knew the Christmas gifts as a token, not a big deal. And what they really wanted to do was to have me tell them about Christmas. And so I got so that when I talked about Christmas, I started in Genesis. And I told them the story up to Christmas, why we had Christmas. And they always enjoyed that celebration of Christmas, even though they were Hindu girls, some were Buddhist. And I think it planted the seed in many, many students' lives. But as we lived together, we shared stresses. We helped people work out problems. We lived with people. And I think that is much the way that Jesus probably showed us that we were supposed to do originally too. It just happened that our situation worked out to be very similar to the situation that Jesus had lived in. So I'm going to leave you with a version of Acts 1:8 for you. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be Jesus' witnesses in St. Albans, in all of West Virginia, the surrounding states, and to the ends of the earth. Oh, I forgot one more thing I wanted to tell you. It's from Harriet Jane Olson. It's from our prayer calendar. And she said, just as God has called women into mission service for the last 150 years, God is calling women today. United Methodist women members are growing spiritually and in sisterhood, developing ourselves as leaders and responding to God's call through service, witness, and advocacy on behalf of women, children, and youth. And that's really what I was privileged to work with for 35 years while I was in Nepal.